Hey PPLD makers, my name's Jennifer, and today we're going to be talking about bookbinding. Now, bookbinding is the process of sewing paper together to make things like handmade books, journals, scrapbooks, and things like that. And while there's lots of different ways to do bookbinding, today we're going to cover two different stitches. One is called the pamphlet stitch, and the second is called a stab binding. Here are a few things you'll need to get started. So to get started with bookbinding, the main things that you'll need are paper, a sewing needle, and thread. Today I'm using a pretty thick sewing needle. It has to be pretty sturdy because it's going to be going through multiple sheets of paper. I've got a spool of waxed thread here, which is nice for bookbinding because again it's really sturdy. But you can use whatever thread that you have around the house or have access to. The paper I'm using is plain copy paper that I have cut in half. So I only have 5 sheets here, cut in half, that makes 10, and that should be plenty of paper to do both of these bindings. And I also have 2 sheets of decorative paper. These are 12 by 12 sheets of scrapbook paper that I've cut in half that we're going to use for the covers of our books. Other things that are useful to have are something like a push pin or a safety pin, and that will help us punch the holes that we'll be using to sew the book together. Either a binder clip or like paper clips or clothespins or something like that to hold the papers together while you're sewing. And of course you'll probably need scissors to cut the thread, cut the paper, and everything like that. So the things we'll need to get started with the pamphlet stitch are, I'm using 4 sheets of paper, you can use more or less, as well as one of our pieces of decorative paper. We're going to hold those together and fold the whole stack in half. The pamphlet stitch is a stitch that's kind of done on a folded spine. So we have our papers all folded together. And then you're going to take either your push pin or your safety pin, and you're going to make 3 holes in the center of your paper on that fold that you just made. You can measure these out if you'd like to be really precise. I'm just going to eyeball it today. Another good thing to do is to go ahead and use that binder clip to secure all these pages together so that your hole doesn't move around on you. So I'm going to go ahead and stab the first hole. You can also kind of wiggle your push pin around to make these holes bigger. You're going to have thread going through these holes multiple times, so it won't hurt to give yourself a little room. And so now we have 3 holes punched in the center of our book. The amount of thread that you'll need to do this is 3 times the length of the spine. And that'll give you a little extra as well. So I'm going to measure out 3 lengths of my thread and give myself a little wiggle room and cut. And then you'll go ahead and thread that onto your needle. So the first stitch that you're going to do to complete the pamphlet stitch is you're going to start on the outside of your book, and you're going to bring the needle through the middle hole to the center of the book. And you don't need to tie a knot at this point, but just leave kind of a short end there for yourself, and make sure not to pull that through as you keep stitching. The next thing you're going to do is to take your needle from that middle hole into the top hole. So I'm going to go ahead and push that through, and you can leave this a little loose for now, especially so that you don't pull that end through. Then you'll bring your needle up through the bottom hole, which is the only one that you haven't sewn through yet. So you'll notice now that we have 1 loop on the inside of the book, and then we have a longer loop on the outside of the book. And so the final thing that you'll do, the final stitch, is to bring your needle through the middle hole. So now you'll have 2 loops there that you can tighten up a little bit by pulling the ends of your thread. And then on the outside, you have these 2 ends, and I usually like to bring one on either side of the long stitch that's on the outside of the book. And then you'll just tie that off. So make sure it's as tight as you want it and give it a little square knot. You can even do a cute little bow to finish it off. And I usually trim those ends down so they're not getting in the way as you're enjoying your book, but you can kind of lay the bow flat. And there you have your very first hand-bound book. So the stab binding works a little bit differently. Instead of folding our paper in half, we're going to work with a full sheet of paper. So for that reason, I'm using a few more sheets. I have 6 sheets of our half paper here. And you're still going to punch 3 holes, but you're going to punch them along one edge, and we're going to stitch through those holes and also around the edges of the book to secure it together. And I'll show you what that looks like in a minute, but first we're just going to need to poke 3 holes in our paper, and I would do that about a 1/2 inch in from the edge. It helps to mark this in a line, and I do not currently have a ruler, but I'm just going to go ahead and use my other book that I made to kind of draw a straight line down the side of my paper. I'm going to go ahead and use that binder clip again to secure all of this together. And I'm going to poke 3 holes, which again you can measure out evenly along that line that I just drew. So use our push pin again, and again make the holes wide so that we can sew through them easily. Okay, so I've got my 3 holes that I punched in the edge of my paper there. And this time we need a little bit more thread than our last binding, so I'm going to use about 4 lengths of the spine here, plus a little extra to thread my needle. So the first thing we're going to do, I'm going to call the binder clipped edge the top. So you're going to bring your needle from the back to the front through the top hole. And again, you're not going to tie a knot right away, but you can leave a little tail that we can tie in later. And then you're going to stitch into the middle hole. And this one you can keep a little more taut than we did with the pamphlet stitch. So I'm just going to make sure that is taut along the edge. So I've sewed from the top hole to the middle hole, and now I'm going to sew through the bottom hole. And now once we have the thread down at the bottom of our book, we're actually going to wrap that thread around the bottom of the pages, and we're going to go back up through that bottom hole. So you'll see now that we have 1 stitch that goes around the bottom of the spine. We're also going to take that stitch around the side of the book. So we're making like a little half rectangle almost with our stitches. So I'm going to take it around and again back through that bottom hole. And so you'll see here that we've got a stitch around the bottom and around the side. Next thing we'll do is the same thing but with the middle hole. So I'm going to take it back through the middle hole and then bring our thread around the edge of the spine. I'm going to pull that stitch back through the middle hole and pull that tightly. So you'll see now that we're stitching around, we're not only stitching the pages together, but we're stitching around the edge of the book to secure the pages in place. All right, so next thing we'll do is come up through the top hole, and you want to make sure that you also don't split your thread, which is where you kind of sew through kind of the middle of a previous thread, which I was just about to do, because that makes it a little bit difficult to tighten up your sewing later when you finish. And so now I'm going to bring my thread around the top of the book like I did before with the bottom and stitch through that top hole again. And then finally, you can see that pretty much the last thing that we have left is to stitch around the binding back into the top hole. Now I'm just going to bring this thread to the back of the book where my other end is, and we'll go ahead and tie that in place. And so you'll see, once I've got that tied in place, that we have our stitches over the top and the bottom of this binding, as well as around the sides. And with this binding, to finish it off, to make it a little bit easier to read as you go along, you can fold open each of the pages along that binding that you just sewed so that it's ready for you to write in it, or add scrapbooking things, or, you know, use it as a sketch pad, whatever you are hoping to use your book for. And now, with our edge folded up, it's a little bit easier to read. So we've covered 2 different stitches in this video, the stab binding and the pamphlet stitch. So for our books today, we just used plain copy paper and some scrapbooking paper to make decorative covers. There's lots of options for other materials that you can use. You can think about things like junk mail, found items, used paint chips, newspaper clippings, or old wrapping paper. Things like that can all make really interesting and exciting books. And for thread, we used wax thread here, but if you have wax dental floss, that operates in basically the same way. You can also use sewing thread or embroidery thread. Just it needs to be strong enough to go through the different sewing holes in multiple passes and to hold your book together strongly. So think about other materials that you could use to make interesting books. If you're hoping to learn more about the stitches that we covered today, or more advanced stitches, the library has a lot of resources on bookbinding, and I'll link to some of those in the description below, as well as some other resources that you can find. So thank you for joining us to do some bookbinding today. I hope you found this video useful. If you share anything that you make from this tutorial on social media, be sure to hashtag it with PPLD Take and Make. And thank you so much for watching, and have an excellent day.